Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 491, and today I'm joined by Dave DeCamp, the news editor at antiwar.com. Dave, how you doing today?
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, happy to have you back here, Dave. I feel like it's a good time to have a conversation with you. I know we both, mostly cover day-to-day news on our shows, but in your show, by the way, Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp, it's a daily show where you talk about everything you write. It's absolutely fantastic and really keeps everybody up with the day-to-day of foreign policy. But, rather than looking at the individual news stories, I want to ask some broader overview kind of questions about what you think's going to happen and what's currently going on with the Israeli bombing campaign of Gaza. And so I think one question that I've gotten asked quite a bit by people is, why did Hamas do this? And, exactly what was their goal? Because a lot of people are kind of, I think, left confused and end up blaming Hamas because they say, well, if it was so predictable that Israel's going to commit a genocide, didn't Hamas intentionally provoke a genocide against the Palestinian people? And so just I'll let you weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to know exactly what Hamas's goals here were. I think the fact that they took a lot of hostages shows that they expected to be able to negotiate, use them as leverage. They said that their main demands, I mean, in videos and stuff that they put out after the attack, that they wanted, the thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are held in Israel to be released. They wanted some other things. They called for, an end to the occupation and blockade. But I think realistically, they probably knew that Israel would respond in a pretty big way. So then there's the question is if they wanted to provoke, an attack on Gaza like this, or maybe an invasion, because if you look at past wars, Israel has never really had much luck going into Gaza. They tried in 2014 and took a lot of heavy casualties. So then they just resorted to heavy airstrikes. But the airstrikes that we're seeing right now, I mean, are heavier than anything Israel's ever done before by a long way. So it's tough to know if Hamas expected it to be this brutal, Israel's response. And I know, they say that this attack was 2 years in the making, and there was a lot of things Hamas was angry about, of course. And just in the past year with the Netanyahu government coming in, I remember thinking, with all the stuff going on in the West Bank, they had these big raids and lots of, provocations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I remember thinking at the time, when these things were happening, that there wasn't much of a response from Gaza, but I guess it's because they were planning this big attack here. So, yeah, I mean, what exactly did they expect to get out of this? I think that's a good question that I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I guess, Connor talks and has covered Connor Freeman, the co-host. He comes on the show every Friday, and typically, he covers the Middle East news. And over the past, particularly this year, 2023, he's really been screaming on the show about how poorly the Israelis have started treating the Palestinians with the new Netanyahu government. And just, this Ben Gavir that's in the government and a couple other officials just get pretty close to outright, from their position in government, a high ranking position in government, saying it's time to just move the Palestinians off of what we claim is Israel. And so, that it seemed like at some point that was going to cause some kind of major reaction. We also had, encroachments on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the, most holy sites in, Islam overall, but I think probably for the Palestinian people, maybe the most important site for them is that mosque. And, the day before this occurred, the Hamas attack, there was a restriction put on the Al-Aqsa Mosque that I think basically anybody, particularly a male under the age of 60, was not allowed to go there. And so, that was a particular provocation. And also, Washington was working very hard to work not only with Israel, but also with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and all these other countries to normalize relations with Washington and really to cut out the Palestinians and say, we're going, like, if the, they offer Saudi Arabia a nuclear program where they allow the Saudis to enrich their own uranium, which would, give them all the necessary capabilities, at least technologically, to build a nuclear weapon if they chose to one day, if they signed a NATO style or Japan style security agreement with Saudi Arabia. I mean, if they're willing to give everything to the Saudis, I'm sure they would be willing to trade away the Palestinians. And so there's a lot of talk that this particular attack and the Israeli reaction have really frozen, if not outright destroyed, any chance of normalization between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. And so all that, I'm guessing, all factored into this attack as well. So I don't know if you don't have anything on that. I got another question for you.
Yeah, and I remember pretty recently there was reports that basically said, the Saudis were looking for a nuclear program and they're looking for a mutual defense treaty with the U.S. And they were kind of paying lip service to some of the Palestinian concerns, but there were some reports that basically said that the Palestinian stuff didn't really matter to them, that the main thing that they wanted was this defense treaty with the U.S. and that they weren't willing to really try to get much out of the Israelis when it came to the Palestinians.
Yeah. So we have that, and then we have this bombing campaign. And as you said, it's been really significant, the amount of bombs that are being dropped in such a small area. I'm not sure if it was one of your articles or somewhere else. I read that I think in 2019, the U.S. dropped like 7,000 bombs on Afghanistan, the entire country, and Israel dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza in 6 days. And so, just to understand like the scale and the devastation of that, why do you think Israel has taken such a heavy-handed approach?
I mean, I think they see the opportunity after this attack to, push these people out of Gaza. I mean, that seems to be their goal just by what they're doing. They ordered the evacuation of North Gaza, an area where 1.1 million people live. And it seems like they want to just kind of conquer North Gaza. The Israelis, you see a lot of things that Israel is saying they don't have a plan for after they go into Gaza and take out Hamas. That's what they're saying that their goal is. And Biden actually said it would be a bad idea for Israel to, reoccupy Gaza or kind of take it over. But I think it's pretty clear that that's what Netanyahu and other officials in his government are thinking right now, is that they could really turn things up. They have imposed a complete siege on them. I mean, some aid has been let in now, but it's barely anything considering how many people are there, and the fact that all the food, water, electricity is not going in, and there's no fuel. So they're trying to starve them out. They're trying to bomb them out. I think they're just hoping eventually Egypt lets a big influx of refugees in, and that they could just, take over the Gaza Strip. The big thing is that I think once they actually go in, it's going to be a brutal fight. Another question that we don't really know, nobody's really telling us how many, Hamas fighters are actually being killed in these airstrikes. Once in a while you'll hear about a Hamas commander getting killed, but you don't even see Israel really putting out numbers and claiming that they're killing a lot of Hamas fighters, because you have to think they have these big, extensive tunnels under Gaza. They're probably just waiting this out, this air campaign. And I know that there's I think it was Seymour Hersh reporting that Israel plans to use, bunker buster bombs to try to blow up the tunnels. But, how much could that really do? So I think once they go in, it might be, and anybody that's left, anybody in Gaza that's left after this bombing campaign that can pick up a gun is going to, probably join the fight against Israel, even if they're not Hamas, after what they've done in this past couple weeks. So it could be really brutal. And then there's always the risk of Hezbollah intervening. So who knows if Israel can even conquer the Gaza Strip. But I do think that's the plan. There was this Israeli think tank that has ties to the Likud party that basically put out a plan for the complete ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, pushing all 2 million or 2.3 million residents out. I think that's what they want. They want a final solution for the Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, so I think I agree with you that this, at least the north half of Gaza is probably the minimum, but they're really looking to take probably the whole thing if they end up being able to get away with it. Now, I guess, we have seen more people paying attention to the Palestinian cause. I was just driving around yesterday and listened to probably a half hour on NPR of this Palestinian journalist really berating an NPR host for asking questions that were, meant to make the Palestinians look bad, which is like, well, the Palestinians are ruled by Hezbollah, so don't they all deserve this? Or not Hamas, so don't they all deserve this? And things like that. She was absolutely killing it. But, that people are able to say Israel's an apartheid state. And while that certainly isn't the rhetoric of many government officials, it is, I think, becoming more prominent. And so, you do wonder if at some point, like, there's going to be enough pressure and enough people just absolutely disgusted, not inside of government, but the humans of this country outside of government, to maybe put some brakes on this. But I don't know. I never try to get too optimistic about public pressure demand ending a war. So, let's mention this. They're trying to tie the all the aid together. The Ukraine aid, the Israeli aid, aid to Taiwan, border security. What do you think about this plan, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a minute where I was hopeful, before this Gaza war started, that they were going to have trouble getting this Ukraine aid through with all the drama in the House. And that's still going on. I think the best we could hope for is them just failing to elect a House Speaker for a while and delaying all of this. But I have a feeling that whoever gets elected, this $105 billion, aid package that Biden has requested Congress, I think it's going to get passed. If it's brought to a vote, they're going to pass it. And the power that the Republicans against the Ukraine aid have in Congress is that they can prevent things from getting introduced. But I think with all this delay and all this stuff that's going on in the House, that once they do get a speaker, they're just going to put this thing forward for a vote, and nobody's going to try to oust the speaker again and go through that whole, I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think eventually this monstrosity is just going to get passed through. I mean, the Ukraine, though, is big. I mean, it's like, what, $61 billion for Ukraine?
Yeah.
After this failed counteroffensive. So we'll see. I mean, that's just a huge amount of money. And the idea is so that it can last for a year through the 2024 election, because they figure opposition to that war is going to continue to grow. And then it's unfortunate to see the Republicans against that are all in on arming, giving $14 billion more to Israel. So I don't know. I just am kind of fearing the worst here, that they're just going to keep both wars going.
So, by the way, I wasn't going to even ask you about this. So, if you don't have an answer, I completely understand, because I certainly don't. Do you have any idea how they're still funding the war in Ukraine without Congress passing anything? Are they still tapping into that accounting error $6 billion fund, and that's all they have left? I think they only have just a couple million, 100 million left in foreign military financing for Ukraine. So, I mean, I'm kind of baffled as to how they've kept this war going over the past month after they said it was in crisis, at the end of September.
Yeah, I think they still have around like $5 billion in that money that became available from like an accounting error, which can kind of go a long way. I mean, they haven't, the last weapons package that they gave Ukraine was earlier this month, was worth about 200 million. Haven't seen one since then, but I think that's basically what's keeping it going. Another thing that they're out of is this budgetary aid that they call it, which basically funds the Ukrainian government. And that I think they're tapped out of that. They just gave them their last 1.5 billion or so, or 1.1 billion. They've been dispersing it every month, so they don't have another payment for November. So I think that's the thing Ukraine is worried about. The government is that they're running out of money to keep paying their salaries and pensions and things like that the U.S. taxpayer has actually been paying for this past year and a half.
And I guess I could imagine Germany, the UK, France picking up a month. And I'm sure they're already kicking in a little every month too. But I can't imagine that going on for very long. And so, if there's not a potential resolution on the horizon, that could be the real stopper there. Maybe they still have money for the military, but not for the government. That would be interesting. To switch back to the situation in Israel here, chances of a wider war. People who listen to our shows know I could set up all the news stories behind it, what's going on in Iraq and Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. But what do you think are the chances at this point of a wider war breaking out and the U.S. getting involved?
I mean, it seems pretty high at this point. If you just look at, there's been all these attacks on U.S. troops in Syria and Iraq, and they're expecting. It's still not exactly clear when Israel plans to go into Gaza, or if that's still the plan, is a big ground invasion. But there's just a thing I wrote up today about that said that Israel agreed to delay the invasion so the U.S. could send more air defenses to the region, because they're expecting once Israel goes in, there's going to be, a huge escalation of attacks on U.S. troops in the region in Syria and Iraq. And I think that's right. So I think the thing we have to worry about is Biden bombing these Shia militias like he's done before over much, smaller attacks and then have been happening. And, usually when that escalates like that, they fire some rockets at the U.S. bases. The U.S. bombs these Shia militias and kills a few dozen of them. Then they might, fire another rocket volley, but then that's really it. But I think this time, I don't think they're going to back down. And, who knows who else is going to get involved. The U.S. said that the Houthis tried to fire some missiles and drones at Israel. And, of course, Hezbollah is kind of the big one. But if you look at the rhetoric from the U.S., they're saying that they're going to blame everything on Iran, essentially. So then there's the implication that, does that mean that the U.S. is going to directly attack Iran, and this is going to become, a huge regional war between the U.S., Iran, and whoever else is involved? And then who knows how things are going to go in Gaza. There's a chance that the U.S. might even get directly involved there, either with airstrikes or special operations forces or something. So there's a lot of ways that this thing can get out of control.
Yeah, I'm really concerned. I guess the only thing that makes me think that this might not break into a wider war is somebody in the Pentagon who has, all the charts on however many, missile defense systems they have and Patriot interceptors they have and how long it's going to take for Raytheon to make more is like scrambling because every single column is in the red. And how are they going to have enough interceptors for Taiwan to fight the war against Iran and for Ukraine? It doesn't seem feasible. Now, I know there are American politicians who really want to fund the empire to the extent that we could do that, but just logistically, how much the West has struggled to arm Ukraine, which really is just a war taking place in the eastern half of that country, how they would fight a Middle East wide war and also maintain enough arms in the Pacific region for a potential conflict with China and or North Korea, because we're still trying to provoke Kim Jong-un. So what do you have any thoughts on that before I ask you the next question?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, is how sustainable would that be for the U.S.? And, there was just, the U.S. just started sending artillery shells to Israel that were originally bound for Ukraine, which already shows that they might be being stretched thin just with the situation how it is now. So yeah, like a major war with Iran and everybody in the Middle East, I think might force the U.S. to kind of wind down the thing in Ukraine. Um, and yeah, it does just seem impossible for the U.S. to be able to maintain Ukraine, a big war in the Middle East, then also continue to arm Taiwan and get ready for a war with China. It just doesn't seem possible.
So I want to ask you about the Baptist hospital bombing. Just if you had any thoughts on what happened there. I know everybody's looking to point a finger in one direction or another. I've my opinion is that it was an Israeli strike of some kind, but I've said on the show I'm not sure of that, and there's certainly not conclusive evidence one way or the other. However, the Israeli manufacturing of evidence does does make me suspect that you wouldn't manufacture evidence that of like the Hamas call, saying it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad and they know it, unless you needed to. And so, anyways, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think the strongest case in the on the Israeli side is the fact that the night that this was reported, everybody, myself included, assumed that the hospital was leveled. They said 500 people were killed, and then the next morning, you see the pictures that the strike was actually in the parking lot and the buildings were all intact. Um, and yeah, I initially assumed Israeli airstrike. Now my thinking is that I still think it was probably Israel, but I don't know for sure. Now, one of the big piece of evidence that Israel put out was this footage from an Al Jazeera feed that showed a rocket exploding in the sky and falling, and it was near where the explosion was, and then you see the blast at the hospital. Um, but there was just this thing from the New York Times. They did a big visual investigation, and they found that rocket was actually much further away from the hospital than and not related to the blast at the hospital. They also said that rocket looked like it was a missile fired from Israel, not fired from within Gaza. So it just shows that big piece of evidence that the U.S. and Israel are relying on just isn't, a reliable piece of evidence. So that New York Times investigation did not say one way or the other if they thought it was an Israeli strike or a strike from, or an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket like Israel is saying. And I'm no munitions expert, and you see people just saying different things by looking at the picture of where the thing hit. So I lean more towards some sort of Israeli strike just by the size of the explosion, but then they say it could be spent fuel from a misfired rocket. Fact is, we just don't really know, and the death toll is kind of being questioned because they initially said 500, and then the Gaza's health ministry settled at 471. U.S. intelligence is saying it's probably somewhere between 1 and 300. So I think it's pretty clear that it's in the hundreds because the strike did hit outside, but there are thousands of people taking refuge at the hospital and sleeping outside because this is in Gaza City where they were told to evacuate. So they went there hoping that the hospital wouldn't be hit. But I think there's enough evidence that shows Israel is kind of putting out this fake evidence that makes me, lean towards it was probably just Israel. But yeah, again, we don't really know for sure. But it's one of those things. It's like I feel like I've wasted too much time trying to figure out because so much has happened since then, and so many more people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. But it's like kind of a big PR victory for Israel because they convinced everybody, oh, see, they lied about the hospital bombing. And you see a lot of people bringing up now, saying that you can't trust the numbers coming out of Gaza and all that.
No, I mean, that bombing happened probably in what, 4 or 5 hours before Biden was boarding whatever flight he was boarding to fly to Israel. So, the timing of that I think is absolutely huge. If this is an Israeli strike, I mean, Biden's going to be flooded with questions during his entire visit in Israel as to how, while the Hamas attack was horrific, Israel just wiped out a third half of what Hamas killed in a second in a hospital courtyard. And so it seemed absolutely unbelievable to me that Israel got away with changing the narrative there so quickly. And especially now, so much of the evidence that Israel has put out has shown either not to show what they claimed or to be fabrications. Now, I do think a point on the other side, and not that a lack of evidence necessarily proves anything one way or the other, but it is interesting that Hamas hasn't turned up any kind of Israeli shrapnel or anything
Yeah, yeah,
of
I
this.
agree.
Or hell, there's got to be tons of it laying around Gaza. I'm surprised they like haven't just brought some kind of munition and said, "Oh, this is what caused it." So, at this point, I know it won't be the conclusive thing because everybody will just say, "Oh, they got it from somewhere else." Well, I mean, that's fair. I'm sure Hamas would do something like that if it was one of their rockets, but I don't think the evidence really points, conclusively either way. But it does seem that everything that everybody said to prove it wasn't Hamas has turned out to be absolutely false.
Yeah, yeah, and that is a good point. That's something I meant to mention that yeah, they don't have any remnants of whatever hit. And yeah, you would think, if they wanted to put the blame on Israel, that they could have found something probably pretty close by that came from an Israeli missile, but they didn't do that.
So, Dave, I mean, want to wrap up here pretty soon. Just wanted to, I guess, get your thoughts on where do you think we go from here, as far as I guess it's possible the ground invasion might not happen, but I guess do you see any mounting pressure or anything for the U.S. to curtail its support for Israel or something that would bring this, because over it hasn't just been since 2014 there's been Israeli airstrikes in Gaza. It happens every few months, every few years that there's a short little bombing campaign, and sometimes people will say, oh, this is it, this is the one where the Hamas and Israel go to war, and tempers and mood flare down pretty quickly, 24 48 hours, and Egypt or Qatar or Jordan has established a ceasefire. So um, do you see any possibility of de-escalation on the horizon here? I mean, my concern, I guess, is that the American rhetoric from most politicians, not from the people, but from most politicians, is almost more extreme than most of the rhetoric I'm hearing from Israel. Now, I don't speak Hebrew, so I guess I may be missing some of the more extreme things, but I do read a lot of Israeli English media, and there are politicians talking about a second Nakba, but there's far more American members of Congress talking about turning Gaza into a parking lot.
Yeah, it's true. And it seems like there's more room for conversation within Israeli media, like, you know, talking about the causes of the attack and stuff, especially from Haaretz. But it seems like right now the Israeli military is ready to go. According to the Israeli media that I've been reading, they don't want any more hostages released because they think that's going to slow things down. The military is ready to go in, and they're just waiting for the word, and they're putting pressure on the government to give them the order. So at this point, I mean, I can't imagine them just backing down, Israel just kind of stopping this. You have Hamas basically saying that if you stop bombing, we'll release at least all the civilian hostages. I think some of them have also said we'll release all the hostages if you just stop bombing. Um, but I think it's pretty clear that Israel, the hostages are not the big concern here. I think, again, that they do see an opportunity to really do damage here. And if you look at the rhetoric, the U.S. is saying that Israel has to, put an end to Hamas and stuff. So I think they're going to support that. And there is talk about the U.S. saying, how about instead of a full-scale invasion, you continue the airstrikes and do like limited raids into Gaza. I'm not, so they might try to scale down the invasion plans a bit. I think they're worried about Israel occupying Gaza if they like take it over. But again, even if the U.S. is like against that, it doesn't really matter. It's not like I don't think they're gonna do
Well,
much
in a
to.
massive bombing campaign would probably make Gaza unlivable for at least
Yeah,
the Palestinians. Um, one last thing, real quick. I guess a lot of people are trying to say that a lot of the more pro Tel Aviv people are trying to say that, well, the Palestinians should go somewhere else at this point. And so I guess a couple of questions. One, when people say, well, why don't the people of Gaza leave? I think some of them actually don't want to leave. Like, they would rather die in their houses at this point than go to Egypt. But two, people will point out, well, why don't the Egyptians or the Jordanians or the Syrians just take the Palestinians, and, they could go be Arabs somewhere else? And so I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
yeah. Well, I know Egypt. They don't want a big influx of refugees, and they're also saying they don't want Israel to cleanse Gaza of the Palestinians. They don't want a second Nakba. And yeah, people always say that. Why doesn't the Arab countries take Palestinians? But there's lots of Palestinian refugees living in all these countries. I know in Jordan, there's a huge population, a few million Palestinian refugees or descendants of Palestinian refugees. So it's not like they haven't taken them before. I think right now the Arab countries are, their position is that they don't want Israel. If they let them in, they don't think they're ever going to go back. So I think there's kind of two reasons there: is that they don't want to have to deal with a bunch of refugees, and also kind of just the fact that they don't want Israel to be able to, take over Gaza.
Right. That's a really important point there. It's like them consenting in a lot, like according to the current narrative, that's like the Arab countries consenting to the ethnic cleansing of the rest of
Mhm.
Palestine. Right? The Palestinian people, which are their own unique people, are supposed to be removed just because they're Arab and Muslim like the other people of the Middle East. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of the logic here. So, yeah, it's crazy the number of Americans who say they would shoot any federal agent who came to their door and asked for their guns, who then can't understand why a Palestinian would fight for their homeland. It seems kind of strange to me. But
Yeah.
anyways, Dave, anything else? If not, tell people about what you're doing and where they could find your work.
Um, yeah, you could always find my writing at antiwar.com in the news section up there. You can follow me on Twitter at DeCamp Dave, or listen to my show, Anti-War News. It's on YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, or you could listen to the podcast version.
And you're gonna be on Timcast coming up soon, right?
That's right. Yeah, November 3rd, I'll be on Timcast. It's a Friday.
Wow, that's next week, right?
Yeah,
All
yeah, and
right.
Scott's doing this Friday, so
Yeah. And
it'll
everybody
soften them up for me.
keep an eye out on antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. It should be later this week, Friday. Connor Freeman and Scott Horton are working on a really in-depth article on Hamas. And so I think that'll be real
Nice.
important. Anyways, Dave, thank you so much for coming back on the show. We'll have to do it again.
Thanks, Kyle.